Hello, everyone. Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, wherever you are. My name is Shaili Prasad. I'm the Executive Director for the Center for Global Health and Social Responsibility at the University of Minnesota. Thank you so much for joining for our 8th annual Quie and Peterson Lecture. Our topic today is Decolonizing Global Health, Tackling Epistemic Injustice and Unfair Knowledge Practices. We have an amazing speaker with us today, who I'll introduce shortly. But first, I want to honor two people who have been integral to our center and the University of Minnesota, Dr. Paul Quie and Dr. Phil Peterson, after whom this lectureship has been named. As long-standing leaders within our global health community and as founders of our center, they have built this platform we are now using to strengthen the University of Minnesota's ties with partners around the world. We know they're watching on Zoom today. This is Dr. Quie's 100th year, and he's watching this with Dr. Peterson and another amazing supporter of our center, Dr. Cliff Steer. Thank you. The Quie and Peterson Lecture has been an opportunity for us to showcase the work of brilliant global health practitioners speaking to timely issues in a diverse range of fields. We have had an amazing group of speakers at our past events on topics that remain vitally important, such as the political determinants of health, the global climate crisis, spillover effects of a pandemic, and compassion in global health. We are excited for this year's event to add to those critical conversations. But before we begin, I want to remind you that this webinar is being recorded and will be available after the event. I also encourage you all to post questions in the Q&A section of the Zoom, and I'll keep an eye on those to post those questions to our speaker. By the way, we also have a watch party, primarily of students at the University of Minnesota watching this. This year's theme is Epistemic Injustice and Unfair Knowledge Practices in Global Health. Unfair knowledge practices in global health reinforce inequities and violate the dignity of those affected. These practices favor the perspectives of privileged researchers and institutions in high-income countries, while simultaneously failing to remedy the problems they purport to solve. Global health academic research, unfortunately, lacks adequate representation from Global South and otherwise marginalized groups and remains deeply entrenched in a culture of colonialism that is counterproductive to its aims. Our 8th annual Quie and Peterson Lecture focuses on the issue of epistemic injustice in global health and how academicians can identify their own biases, what holds those biases in place, and create practices better tailored to serve the communities they work with. I cannot think of a better person to address this topic than our speaker today. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Seye Abimbola. Dr. Abimbola is a health systems researcher from Nigeria. He is currently based at the University of Sydney in Australia, where he is an associate professor and principal research fellow. His teaching and research focus on knowledge systems in global health, health systems governance, and the adoption and scale-up of health systems innovations. Between 2020 and 2022, Dr. Abimbola was a Prince Claus Chair at Utrecht University in the Netherlands for his work on justice in global health research. He also received an Australian Research Council Discovery Award to study dignity-based knowledge practices in global health. He was the inaugural editor-in-chief of BMJ Global Health between 2015 and 2024, which I'm sure many of our people in the audience remember him from that time, and a Radulawaki visiting scholar at Northwestern University in Chicago recently, 2023 and 2024. His book, which I'm looking forward to read, is a collected volume of old and new essays titled The Foreign Gaze, Essays on Global Health, and will be published by Editions IRD later in 2024. Dr. Abimbola is joining us from Geneva, where he just mentioned that he's a thinker in residence. What a wonderful title. Seye, Dr. Abimbola, we are thrilled to have you here today. And with that, I'll hand the Zoom platform over to you.
Thank you very much. And I'll share my screen now. Does that appear good?
Yes.
So thank you very much, Shaili, for inviting me to give this lecture. And I, knowing that the people after whom it is named are in the audience, I think makes it feel even more special. So my regards to Dr. Quie and Dr. Peterson And I have a huge admiration for people who build institutions or who build groups and who stay the course and make sure and nurture them. So I huge respect for you. What I thought I would do today is present a sort of reframing, perhaps, of this problem of epistemic injustice, or what I prefer often to call unfair knowledge practices, because that makes it more accessible. To reframe it slightly in terms of connection and in terms of power, and what power does to connection and what power does to one's ability to grasp the truth, or at least to know. Um, there's a saying by James Baldwin that I think in many ways is the reason why I have chosen this focus. And what Baldwin said, which I will reiterate about someone else in the first slide, which I'm here to show you, is that ignorance allied with power is the most ferocious enemy that justice can have. And I think about that a lot. I think about what that means for research, for academic research in a field such as global health, a field that is set up in large part to generate knowledge, to address injustices. And if there's something at the heart of that field that speaks to its power and how it uses it, then it, I think, compels us to really examine how its power interact with its ability to generate knowledge that truly that can undo injustices in the world. It's the Nobel week. The Nobel Prizes started getting announced yesterday, and it reminded me of the only Nigerian Nobel Prize winner, who is Wole Soyinka, who won it for literature in 1986. And there's something he said, which in many ways is very much in line with what I've just quoted Baldwin as saying. He was once asked about the relationship of truth, and I'm using truth here to mean knowledge or true knowing, to power. And he said, truth and power for me form an antithesis, an antagonism. I can simplify the history of human society as a contest between power and freedom, truth versus power. Truth for me is freedom, is self-destination. Power is domination, control, and therefore a very selective form of truth, which is a lie. The polarity between these two, in fact, forms for me the axis of human striving in the creation of an ethical society, an ethical community. I think about this kind of thing a lot, and what it does for our ability, again, to do our job properly as academic global health people. And again, to summarize this, the key point here is that there's something about power that creates distance and disconnection. And with distance and disconnection, that it has an effect on our ability to know, whether it is our inability to grasp the truth, or our ability to lie to ourselves successfully about what we ought to know, or our ability to disregard what other people know. And in many ways, that is how I frame the work that we do in global health. Now, what I'm going to do in the next few slides is present two forms of disconnection that brought about or occasioned by power. And of course, the ignorance that trails them. And one is the kind of disconnection that is often between those of us who do global health, whether those who analyze the realities of other people, or those who do research about the realities of other people. That we do those things from a position of power, and as such, from a distance, if we follow Soyinka's argument and Baldwin's argument, from a distance, from a remove. And if we position ourselves as the center, in the sense that, and those about whom, with whom, to whom we do global health, as the periphery. One of the things that becomes clear is that insofar as our distance removes us from knowing, that which it removes us from knows better than us. So the center has power, the periphery knows better. And very often what we do is that we imagine that what works for us at the center in place B, as I've shown on the slide, or a way of seeing the world in place B applies necessarily in place A or situation A. We proceed to impose it. Again, because we have the power to do so. Whereas in many instances, we're dealing with complex social systems and realities. And what is peculiar about those systems and realities is that our account of them, our understanding of them, depends very much on where we stand in relation to them. That is the distance between us and them. But also the audience to whom we address ourselves when we give those accounts. Now, if you imagine a scenario in which we are speaking to people who are us and like us about those people who are far removed away from us, we reinforce those falsehoods. We reinforce our ignorance about their realities. And so again, think about the disconnection here as if we were to be addressing ourselves to them respectfully. If we were to understand what the distance between us and them creates for our ability, means for our ability to know and to do well by them, then we stand in a different place. But if we take those things for granted, as we often do, then we de-optimize ourselves from being useful in serving the purposes that we've set for ourselves. The second type of disconnection, that's disconnection within a system, within any system. And when I'm thinking about this, I often set myself three categories of actors. You will naturally notice from this talk that I think in quite a modular way. So things recur in how I think about the world. Now, if you think about three sets of actors, one set of actors can imagine them to be government or similar entities, similarly powerful entities that tend to be distant from the reality of people, especially of communities that are marginalized. I would think of a second category of actors as communities that are marginalized for various reasons and who are, when they are functioning at their best to achieve equity for themselves, are like activists. And we think of a third category of actors who are practitioners, people who do work on a day-to-day, and who one would assume and hope is governed first by the needs of the communities that they serve, but also by the rules that those communities make and the rules that the government. So they function in a kind of almost dynamic balance when this triangle, as I often like to describe it, is functioning well. So there are three axes in it, one between the government that I call engineers or policymakers, and the community, especially as activists, whom I call emancipators. And the third category of people, I call plumbers, who are sort of practitioners, people who deliver services. Now, I think then of a fourth category of actors, and that's us. I frame us in many instances as people who move knowledge around, who cook it, remix it, present it, represent it, synthesize, all kinds of things we do to knowledge, with the purpose of moving it around. Whether it is connecting one of those actors to the other, or connecting within among each category of those three actors that I mentioned. So knowledge mongers need platforms. Now, again, as I mentioned, I think in a very modular way. So these four sets of actors can exist at any scale. Like you can imagine them existing at all scales. So in a small town, those who would move knowledge around, perhaps you may think of them as town announcers. In the town where I grew up, you'd have those. And the platform that they use may be the marketplace. Or you can think of them at a broader scale as journalists, and the platform they use is the press or media. Now, at another scale, it may be us academics. And again, we use our journals and we sometimes use the media. At a different scale, perhaps in a district health office or a national health ministry, you can think of data officials. And again, they use the platform that is the data system. So it's a kind of function that you can imagine existing at any scale. And the function really is that it helps to move knowledge around, to connect different actors that are otherwise disconnected. And very often, and especially governments that are distant from the realities of the people about whom they design and craft policies. Now, every distance needs a channel of connection, needs agents of connection to connect these three sets of actors together. And I often would add as well that it needs a cloud of witnesses. And for people who know the Bible, I grew up in the church, and this is a phrase from the Bible, from the book of Hebrews. This idea of having a cloud of witnesses, which is almost like an accountability mechanism to hold the powerful actors on one end of this connection to account in how they relate with the less powerful actor at the end of that axis. Now, again, I often ask myself, what is that cloud of witnesses for us who do academic global health? Whenever a powerful entity is a law unto itself, you must know that something very likely will go wrong. And I think part of how I think about us as researchers in global health is really thinking carefully about what holds us accountable. And who holds us accountable, and how do you think about what those structures look like? And I'll return to that point later. So anyway, so knowledge mongers need platforms, but platforms themselves are situated, just as I described earlier, that the person who is given an account is situated in a particular location. So the knowledge platforms that they use. Again, the market in town A cannot serve the market in town B insofar as it's serving the purpose of connecting town A with more of itself, right? And in a similar way, I often make this joke, but I realize that it's quite a compelling way of saying it. That, the BBC, you can't imagine the BBC serving Nigeria in the way that it serves Britain. And again, we have to think about knowledge platforms in a similar way. The BMJ cannot do for Nigeria what it does for Britain. That there's something there that demands our attention. Because platforms serve their owners, serve the spaces where they are located, and as such, and by so functioning, are de-optimized from doing the same or similar for other spaces. No. So I've given you kind of my mental image of how I think about the knowledge ecosystem in global health. And I've given a sense of the kinds of things that disconnect us as academics and researchers from the people we serve, and the need for us to reimagine first how we stand, where we stand in relation to them, to whom we address ourselves when we give account of their realities, and the platforms on which we do so. And then to also think about how within any system where we find ourselves, those complex systems that I mentioned earlier, there are also all these different actors that need to be connected to one another. And again, I'll return to how we can think of our role in those systems. But first, I wanted to talk a bit about the forces that hold disconnection, especially disconnection of academic global health as a community or as a field, that hold the disconnection we have in place. And in many instances, they are also very similar to the forces that hold other disconnections in place. And one of them is what I call compounded spoils. In other words, the more power you have, the more power you're going to get. It's a perverse but not unexpected order of things, that those who have power will get more. And I use a line here from Billie Holiday to illustrate that. If those who know that song, I won't try to sound like Billie Holiday. It's a very peculiar sound. But essentially it gives you a sense of the ways in which those who have power continue to have more, and are able to take for granted that we have power, which again impels us in many ways to really think about what then stops us, what holds us to account, and how do we think about what the structures look. The second one is what I call colonial mentality. Again, this is from the inspiration for this is from a song by Fela Kuti. And here he was talking about the ways in which, even after colonization, there were and there are many people who continue to believe that the colonizer is superior in some sense, or has something to be aspired to that makes them inferior. But again, it's this sense that it's not just on the side of the person who has power, who can they use that power in particular ways, but also on the side of the person who historically has had less, but that's also either comfortable in not having, comfortable in how power is exercised in relation to them, that they then are not in a place to push back or challenge that power. Give it the example of the BMJ or the BBC. Um, the fact that if someone randomly does a study in Nigeria or in India, if he does something in the Lancet or the BMJ, there's a problem. That's the goal. Not everybody, but there is that sense that there's something to be aspired to. Um, and it's that kind of mentality. Again, it's not people weren't just born with that mentality; they were miseducated into it. So hence the next sort of contextual factor that there's a way in which a lot of what we believe and do and practice as researchers are things that have been taught to us that we've come to accept to be the normal way of doing things. Sometimes we do them because it's so normal that our incentives as academics, our career incentives are bound up in them. That it's very hard then to sort of even stop, even when we realize that there's something not right, that it's hard to pull back because we are swimming in an ocean that incentivizes us to do a particular thing. The next category is mislabeling. Again, the ways in which we understand the realities of that distant, complex reality or system is very easily colored by how we've learned to understand and imagine that reality. For example, when we say low and middle income countries, sometimes that label makes sense. A lot of the times it doesn't make sense. I was reviewing grant applications. I spent my weekend reviewing grant applications. I was reviewing them, and there were just many LMIC category literature reviews that do not speak at all to the specific country in which the person wanted to work. And it's just like, why did you have to do this? You're not, So there are also those labels we have that then color our imagination and shape how we even approach the reality. Because you can't see a person clearly if you see them as a category. Or see them as a stereotype in a sense. Whether it's how we describe people as vulnerable. But there are different categories we may use that then sort of shape how we understand reality, which then, of course, means that we easily inflict very unfair knowledge practices in relation to those people. I've spoken quite a bit about the rules that govern our engagement. In many instances, there is this thing of under-governance, which is not so much that it's not so much that there are rules that are being enforced, but that often there are no rules at all. And when there are rules, we bend them to suit our needs. I often make an example of the ICMJ criteria for authorship. It was a surprise to me when I had to write an editorial about it a couple of years ago. And I went and read it between them. I really read it carefully, the entire thing. And I saw that it was actually designed to be inclusive. But by design, there were so many leeway and spaces there to include. But the way we use it, the way that it's used, and it's often quoted to me when I was an editor, it allows you to do this on point one, allows you to do this on point two, and you can do this on point three to include. So in other words, even when rules exist, they don't function to include by themselves. We have to think carefully about mechanisms to make them function in a way that does not further marginalize people who are otherwise marginalized. And then underrepresentation, which again goes to the ways in which very often the people on that other end of that relationship very often do not have representatives among the people at the center, which then also allows people at the center to not regard the other end of the relationship as full, dignified, knowing beings and entities. And again, as I mentioned earlier, our ability to reinforce our biases and views to ourselves consists in large part because we are our own audience. So we speak to ourselves and we reinforce the things we believe to ourselves, and we can be very happy. But there are other people, and again, to the extent that they are represented among us, one, to discipline our accounts, but also to be the people to help us think through what those rules that should govern engagement might look like. For me, are very important things. Now, what I've just presented comes from a piece of synthesis that I did along with a group of friends on unfair knowledge practices in global health. And what we did in that synthesis was to try and bring together what I started to playfully call the complaints literature about unfair knowledge practices in global health. But the more I thought about it, the more I felt it was a fitting label for that literature, because people in the last sort of 5 to 7 years have been more vocal across a range of platforms about what they feel are unfair practices in global health. What was also present in that literature were either clearly articulated suggestions and recommendations for change, or implicit in those complaints, you get a sense of what expectations the practices people were complaining about fell short of. So you can also sort of almost infer what their expectations were from the nature of the complaint. So sometimes people actually clearly articulated and described what those expectations were. So the second article, which my PhD student is leading, is just sent the final full draft to me about 5 hours ago. I have not tried to open it, but this is the summary of what we've synthesized from those expectations. And I think for me, these are very important ways of thinking about where we go from here. And there were 4 sets of expectations we found in that literature. For this, we synthesized about 209 different complaints across 12 academic journals that we selected for this exercise. And the first was to do with transparency. There's a way in which when we do the work that we do it from a particular standpoint, reflect a particular worldview. The choices we make, and we make very many choices, are not neutral. And at the least we can do is really be transparent about why we've done what we've done, whom we are in relation to that which we've studied, whose worldviews have we incorporated, whose worldviews have we left out, and why, especially if we're working with community A, in place A, in situation A, what are the worldviews of that place and how has it shaped the work that we do? Being very transparent in declaring and justifying the choices we make in the work that we do. And again, this speaks to a recognition that there is a long standing marginalization, epistemic marginalization of many groups around the world with whom we do the work with. The second expectation is non-extraction, which is one of the more obvious ones. And it speaks broadly to the question of where and to whom the risks and benefits of knowledge making, use, and sharing accrue. And again, making sure that the knowledge we produce on the backs of the people who produce actually get to benefit primarily. And it's not produced in ways that sort of reproduce existing exploitative arrangements that is society, which in fact is the reason why we're doing the work in the first place. And the third expectation speaks to democratization. And my suspicion is that when this paper is published, this is the one people will find most trouble with. In part because we have so normalized the way we do the work that we do. I was explaining this to a 19-year-old son of one of my colleagues who were at our house 2 months ago. He asked me, what are you working on right now? And I was describing this. And I got to the point about democratization, and I described what it was about to him. I said, "Oh, like you can't just not go to a person's house and start to search under their bed for things, without them actually asking you to do that." And he could see what it was about. And then he said, we don't. Okay, you mean that people don't have the right to just go into a place? And I said, yes, that's what it is. Like, no, I don't have a right to be curious about what's under your bed. I don't have that right. If you want me to look under your bed, and I would want you in the room with me when I'm doing it. Anyway, so it gives you a sense of what it would mean for us, what this expectation would demand of us, that will make sure that the people who are on that other end of the relationship are in a position to act as the person who owns that room, who will lead us into the room, show us where to look, discuss with us how else we might want to look, etc. Again, people should have the ultimate say in how they are researched and to what end. That's what that expectation is. And the final one goes in many ways to the heart of, again, what the field aspires to be, which is a transformational force in the lives and the realities of people around the world. And so, again, holding every bit of research we do to that standard and saying, what is the purpose of this research? And how will the knowledge that we are generating, using, and sharing transform the conditions that bring the problems being studied into existence in the first place? Again, it's almost an invitation here to not just think about the downstream consequences of the structural factors and forces that shape people's lives, but to keep an eye, even if our question is primarily downstream, to ask those questions with an eye upstream, with an eye at structures. And again, it was an expectation that I didn't expect to see come out in the way that it came out. But the more we read through those articles, the more it was clear to me that people want research to do more, or people want researchers to do more, to imagine differently, and to channel efforts in upstream, and not just on sort of individual approximate behavioral explanations of things. Yeah. So after all of this, a big question is what can we do? How should we function as people who do academic global health? I hope one of the things I've been able to make clear is that there are many ways in which we can be disconnectors. But we can also be, and we often are, connectors too. Especially if we understand our primary role as helping to connect a system to more of itself. And if and when we understand that the gaze that we ought to direct our accounts, our analysis, our efforts, is the gaze of the relevant actors within that system, and not self-serving. We can also be connectors if and when we understand that we are very often outsiders to the systems in which we seek to be useful. That each system has its own internal connectors. If we look carefully, if we look with trained eyes, we will see them. Often those connectors are not us. Often our job, if done well, when done well, is to help those internal connectors do their job well and not replace them. And also to help build platforms or make existing platforms stronger to facilitate those connections. And every now and again we may be useful in actually being the person who does the connection. But that again would not be the primary. And this line about connecting a system to more of itself is from a a very almost random book. It's a book, a collection of essays about education system, strengthening the education system in the US. And different, it was a lot about schools, about community, etc. And there's this nice essay in it about the role of connection, written by this woman who studies the education system in the US. And she said to create a healthier system, connect it to more of itself so that it can learn more about itself from itself. And I think in many ways that's what we're trying to do. And what I've tried to do in this talk um, is speak in very, very clear, basic language. I've avoided all the fanciful philosophical jargon that I would otherwise use. But so just describe what it is we are trying to achieve clearly, and so that it's easier for us to have a conversation about it. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Seye. Really appreciate that. It's bringing up a few questions. I would encourage audience members to put their questions in the Q&A section. And I'm going to tee us off, Seye. It's a question that I've had in the back of my mind. You served as the inaugural editor of BMJ Global Health.
Yeah.
How did that experience affect your perspective? And did it evolve during your time there? And my personal question is, what made you leave that too? So.
When my first one of my first exposure to the BMJ, but not my first exposure to academic publishing. So as a medical student, I was on the editorial board and later became editor-in-chief of my medical school's student-run academic journal. So you have very similar things in especially law schools in the US where there will be so that I was the editor-in-chief for my year. And then in my final year, I was at the BMJ as a BMJ clerk scholar. So this scheme they run internationally. Now, at the time, there was an interesting debate going on at the BMJ. This was 2005. And the debate was whether academic journals should remain in the business of publishing research. Which I found fascinating. I was a medical student from Nigeria who had thought, journals publish research. And they were having this debate. And it was one of those things, for me personally, one of the missed opportunities of the internet. That the internet should have liberated us, and we didn't allow it to liberate us from just how we do academic scientific communication. So there was that debate going on. And the most compelling argument, one, was that the magazine called The Economist used to be an academic journal. And then it became something else. And the BMJ was asking itself, is The Economist our future? Of course, it wouldn't ask itself that now anymore. I think that was sailed. But I kept that in my mind, that what does it look like? What would it look like for an academic journal to not think that its primary task is publishing research? So when I was appointed editor-in-chief of BMJ Global, that was what I went into the role with, the mindset, that I want this journal I want this journal's primary purpose to not be publishing research. Of course, it's not seen that way by academics who love to publish research, and we published lots of research. Most of what we published was research. But I understood that if this journal was going to be useful, it was going to have to be doing something else than research. And what I aimed for it to do is to be a forum where people could have genuine, sometimes no holds barred discussion about global health and how to advance this field that we collectively identify with, which is what you would expect a journal will do. And for me, it's a strange thing that it's almost something a journal has to deliberately do, but it's the job anyway. So that was the attitude I brought to the task, and I was grateful in many ways that eventuated. It took a couple of years for me to start to feel comfortable that it was going to do that properly. I also thought, so you asked what changed in my view. I wasn't so clear in my mind when I started the role that BMJ Global Health could not replace a strong Nigerian medical journal or a strong Kenyan medical journal. that it could not. And I wasn't as clear about that when I started. I think it became clearer and clearer to me that this entity here that is BMG Global Health it's not going to do that job. That those spaces need platforms that serve them primarily. This can only serve them secondarily at best. So that was something that changed in my view, and it got firmer and firmer through the years about how I sort of understood what that was about. Why did I leave? Um, a mix of things, but I think the most important reason was that it was too much work, and you can only do that for so long. People are always surprised when they hear me say this, that I had and maintained my full-time day job
Mm.
throughout. And I have two young daughters, 10 and 7. One was born after I became editor-in-chief. So it's just give you a sense of how much work it was. And it became clearer and clearer to me that this is not sustainable. And I have other things I wanted to spend my time doing, one of which was finishing my little book and writing another one.
Thank you for that. We've been getting a bunch of questions. I'm going to start with a question as a follow-up of what you just mentioned. This is a question from a student.
Mm-hmm.
And this follows what you said. It cannot be that for Nigeria. It cannot be that for Kenya. How do we increase accountability of journals to populations whose data is printed in them? The follow-up of that is, have some of our journals be too powerful, like the platforms that they hold, the Lancets and the New England Journal? And how do we then bring the accountability from both an access and role that they play?
That's many questions. Um, uh, I believe that we have to hold one another to account. Um, and I was reflecting with one of my friends recently here in Geneva last week. And I said that I feel that the time is, I feel like I've done my bit speaking in the abstract about what is wrong about certain studies, that I've entered into a phase where I want to pick a study or a body of work and really write an essay explaining why it should not be that way. Respectfully. But I think we have to get into a place and a space where we can hold one another to account in that way. Or otherwise we will, I have another friend here in Geneva said, Shea, people like you. And I said, really? And he said, I think they like you because they don't really read what you've written. Because if they read what you've written, they wouldn't. I said, I suspect that too. Anyway, so there is a sense in which I think it's important to be clearer and sharper in holding one another to account. And in doing that, I often think about what was at the time, still is, the evidence-based medicine movement.
Mm-hmm.
One of the ways in which they disciplined people who did research and disciplined journals that published research was that early on in their history, they will do audits of journals.
Mm-hmm.
They would usually go for the top ones, DMJ, JAMA, Lancet, etc. And they would describe what the journals have done wrong and what authors have done wrong in publishing it. Right. And then based on that, they will generate guidelines, and they will insist that journals use those guidelines, and they will insist that reviewers. So in other words, they build a policing almost mechanism.
Yeah.
I don't think we can get to where we're trying to get to with the kind of changes we have in mind without something similar. Like we have to get ourselves there. And again, we have to do that among ourselves. Yeah.
It's this eternal question, isn't it? How do you socialize good behavior, right?
Yeah.
It takes time, but how do you
Yeah.
then?
Yeah.
Here is another student question. I like how you incorporated artists in your formulation of these concepts, which is fantastic. I'm making a list of Shea's, music choices. Could you include more of this practice and how this connects, particularly in relating to facilitating epistemic injustice or justice?
Yeah. I I think in music a lot. I when I stepped down from VMJ Global Health, I stepped down with a playlist in Spotify. I will encourage you to listen. Let me know if you want a link. So I think in music a lot. And for me, what's important about that, in part, um, is that often that's how people make sense of reality. Because music is often poetry. And the more, it's strange because my wife always complains about this, the more street that music is, the more I like it. In other words, the more it reflects certain points of view on reality
Mhm.
that may otherwise be marginalized.
Mhm.
The more I'm drawn to it, if you see what I mean. So in that sense, it's part of in the way we think about art and literature and poetry. That's how I think about music. And I forgot on that slide to mention the great Lauryn Hill. The miseducation was from Lauryn Hill, that label.
This is wonderful. There are a few more questions coming. One was about neutrality of academic institutions. And I'm sure the polarized world is not new. We are
Mm,
probably seeing more of the polarized world coming to right in front of our face.
yeah.
And then the neutrality of what we do, how do we then, from the viewpoint of practical application of the knowledge generation that we create, how do we keep away from the neutrality while addressing the injustices, which might be epistemic, it might be structural, it
Mm,
might be
mm.
in society?
It's a tricky question. It's a very difficult question to tackle. Um, in part because universities and institutions, well, first we have to remind ourselves that universities were not created for social justice and equity. That's not the point of the institution, not a particular specific university, but the idea of a university was not for that purpose. For universities and entities, including yours, which I really like the label of your center, that has taken, it needed to be said, you know. It wasn't in the water, it had to be said and brought into being. So it's the nature of universities is by itself, by its very nature, to not to uphold the status quo. Um, and one of the best ways to uphold the status quo is to pretend as if you are neutral. Because when you're neutral, of course, you're not involved in the fact that, remember the construction compounded spoils. The spoils continue to compound. But I'm neutral, of course. I'm not, it's life, it's reality. I'm not involved. So there is that, and institutions continue to do that, and we continue to do that. And what makes it even more tricky is there's a way in which we're encouraged to frame evidence generation
Ah,
as if it is neutral. That if I looked at a reality in Nigeria and I know that a group in Nigeria is oppressing another group, and I choose to describe that oppression as oppression, um, that choice is not a neutral one.
right.
I could also choose to describe that as a natural order of things.
Mhm.
That this is how the world works, full stop. And there are people who do that. I could just say one group is oppressing another.
Right.
And we're often encouraged, including by journals, including by the demands of our career advancement, to stay out of things that call things what they are. Um, And again, it's a choice we have to make, what we want to do. But to recognize, I would wish that we recognize when we make a choice to be neutral, that we are in fact being epistemically unjust.
Thank you for that. That question came from Dr. Miguel Fiol, who works a lot with refugee communities here too. Next question is from Professor Bill Ventris from El Salvador. Can you extend your thoughts beyond the academic world of global health? Global health is a huge, big tent things, and there are various actors.
Yeah.
How do we then go beyond? And do you have suggestions for folks beyond academia,
Mm.
this practice?
In many ways, I'm at the WHO for 2 weeks, but I will be in and out, both in person and virtually, for the next 6 months. And part of why I'm here is to engage with people here who do um, who enact knowledge practices, not necessarily academics.
Mm.
Some of them are academics, or at least are researchers, but not all. And how we decide on interventions, for example, which interventions we choose, either choose to implement or choose to support, or choose to commission an evaluation about, or choose to do a review about, and the slant the review has. Um, uh, and whether it's a research foundation, for example, or just a foundation like the Gates Foundation that funds things, the choices they make.
Yep.
These are all bound up in, very many unfair knowledge practices. I'll give one example. I think it was 2, 3 years ago, the Gates Foundation made a call for application from countries on innovation, on innovative practices to achieve something. I can't remember exactly what that thing was, but innovation for something. And they did, 5 sets of also criteria, and the first 4 would make me happy. Like, okay, nationally led, all of those things that you want to see. And the last one was do not propose anything that currently exists in the country. And by the way, they also wanted this thing to be scalable.
Mm.
And you're asking yourself, what do you think the people in that country have been doing all their lives? You think they have no idea that they've been trying? So it's those ways of completely disregarding, diminishing a people.
Yeah.
Like it's in everything we do. We are all knowledge actors, and it's how we engage with that other that this is about.
I think this is an important question, and this is a question from a student, primarily looking at bridging the gap between a particular field and the practical need in a community. We always feel that academia sometimes is too sterile. We very strict sterile practices. How do you then convert that into practical need? And as a student, what advice would you have for somebody wanting to do practical application of the work?
I'm going to say something that's not very nice. Try not to start off your career in academia, because it will mess with you. If you really want to serve the real needs of people, so, in I give that example of engineers and emancipators and plumbers. Now, very often within each of those, there are people who are either researchers or people who are trying to serve a particular need. Now, people in those spaces are more aligned with serving the needs of people than people who are proper academics. Now, the academics who do that well, but they have to almost buck the trend. They almost have to sort of get out of the constraints, because if you are in that system, and if you're a faithful citizen of the country, academia, you won't be able to do that properly. And so it's partly really exploring opportunities that allow you to do that properly, because the incentive system in academia early in your career will not allow you to do that well.
And this is probably a continuation of that. This is from the audience again. It's about understanding one's privilege, whatever privilege that is, economic, colonial, etc., etc.
Yeah.
How do you check that while you are involved in the work that you should be involved in global health?
How do you do what, sorry?
How do you check your privilege?
I'm not sure it's something that can be taught easily. I know there are people who teach those things in the US. I'm not sure it's something that can be taught easily. You have to really be very sensitive and very, very aware. And I'm not sure I know how better to tell you that. But to be really, really, and I think um, to almost be an unbeliever. It's a very
Yeah.
strange word. You have to learn to not believe in your own importance.
Yeah.
And the importance of whatever power structure you find yourself in, to always remind yourself that there are people who are wiser, smarter, who make knowledge, who use knowledge, who advance the cause of equity outside of you and your power system on a day-to-day basis.
Yeah.
Almost to remind yourself of what you really are, while also, and I recognize that there's a tension here.
Yeah.
I'm not saying this is not about false humility, right? Or about not valuing yourself and what you do and can bring, but also not overvaluing it. It's a fine line to walk.
Yeah. Don't suppress it too much. Be honest. Yeah.
Yeah.
There's a quick comment. It's not a question from Dr. Harvey Charles, who indicated that Ole Shoinka in 1999 indicated that artists tend to be at the vanguard of struggles for freedom. So your points are really well done.
Yeah.
A couple of questions, one from Dr. Josh Ryan and one from Dr. Leah Ratner, both asking the question about practical ways academics and funding institutions can minimize these power imbalances, either in academic research or publications or the work in the field.
Where should I start?
And this is one other addition to this. This is one of the things we had talked about before, is how universities are looked at as neo-colonial entities in this space.
Yeah. I feel that especially for us researchers, a question I learned to ask a lot as an editor of a journal is, whose question is this?
Yeah.
Like, who wants to know? Who wants to know the answer to this? Why did they not know the answer to this thing before now? And if they said they wanted to know, is it really a genuine wanting to know, or is it a deflectionary delay tactic wanting to know?
Yep.
What are the real knowledge needs and the real learning needs of the people in that space? What have they been doing with knowledge before we arrived? And what can we do to better serve that purpose? In other words, to really, I think, to put the questions we ask up for careful scrutiny and examination. The way we are used to asking questions is to plug them from the literature, or at least to frame a gap and then, put ourselves in there. And I feel like if I'm going to answer that question, what can we do practically differently? It is to examine the questions we ask, like really, really examine it. Whose question is it? And I have to confess to you that very, very often, the answer to that question left me dissatisfied. First we published those papers, but it was always a question at the back of my mind.
Mm-hmm.
That whose question is this? And that ought to be what leads us. And going back to that student's earlier question about how do you serve a community well, it is actually answering their questions, their real questions. Now, again, as I mentioned earlier, there are reasons why we don't do that. And we have to be honest about this. There are reasons why we don't do that. And one of the reasons is that we want a question that we can answer using a method that the journal will want to publish.
Right.
So we then go back from that end and say, okay, well, I'm going to ask this question because then I can use this method, then I can write this paper, and then I can get it in the New England Journal of Medicine.
Yep.
When I see people ask questions like that, often that is I can understand that that's where it's coming from. Or a funder wouldn't fund me if I was asking this question.
Yeah.
And so I'm going to ask that question. Or funders like this topic right now. So I'm going to go into community and just say, okay, do you guys want digital solutions? And then you sort of you engineer that. So it is really being honest with ourselves. And part of my hope here also is that while recognizing that as individuals we can only do so much, in if there's a system within which you function and the system asks for us to do certain things, it's hard to not do them. But I want to hope that we do them with so much discomfort that when the opportunity arises, we will change that structure.
Yeah. Yeah, the structural changes are sometimes going to be the huge challenge there. This is from Dr. Judy Lasker, who's a well-known sociologist. She asked this question about labeling countries, LMIC, Global North. One of the categories she mentioned that she came across recently was the global majority countries and a global minority countries, which sort of emphasizes a little bit of the power structure. What is your thought about using terms like that? Because we tend to, whether we like it or not, internally categorize things, isn't it? So
yeah. I've used that. I sometimes use it. And what is good about it is that every time you use it, you have to imagine the world slightly differently. It does something to your mind every time. Yeah. Global majority. Yes, of course it's good. See, it's easy to forget. You see, so it's a kind of reminder. It jolts you in a way. So I do like that category. But again, I have to make very clear that there are times when categories that we're not comfortable with are necessary, or they are the only ones that are available.
Yeah.
But I think it's always important. Every time I see LMIC, I have an instinct to question: is it necessary here? Like my head goes there immediately, and I wish that we would all do that. Like, did I have to say LMIC? Is there another category that captures this? Is this African countries? Is this South Asian countries? Is this Bangladesh? Full stop. I guess it's not a category, it's a country. So there are, and I like the global majority minority one. Yeah.
This is wonderful. This is a question that I have had for some time, and an anonymous attendee is asking this question. Are there valuable lessons we learn from indigenous community, in the premise of indigeneity in itself? And from my side, how do you balance the tension between not hyper-romanticizing indigenous knowledge, while at the same time looking at quote-unquote new advances? How do you balance the tension between them?
It's something I think about it. There's when I hear indigenous knowledge or indigenous knowledges, in my head, I sort it into little slightly different sets of things. One of them is knowledge of place and time, which one can only fully grasp when one is on country, when one is embedded. And in the sense that there's something about that is indigenous in that sense. There's also the version in my head, there's also another category of what I would call indigenous knowledge. That is about practices and ways of doing things, and of imagining the world, that have been present for a very long time. And I always argue back at people who want to pitch that as something separate from science. And I would often say that, look, indigenous people didn't come about that by accident. It was a scientific process. Like, people didn't just know that if you go and cut this back of a tree, it will cure fever. That was an accident. It wasn't, I'm not religious. So I was going to say it wasn't the spirits that told them. Of course, people are entitled to spirits' beliefs. But my point is that people figure that out through a process of trial and error, through a process of checking and testing and learning over time. So for me, that's a category of indigenous knowledge, which in my head I don't separate from disciplinary inquiry because it came about through disciplinary inquiry. You may not have been written in the paper, or you may have plotted a 2 by 2 table that sort of do all the things you do with a P, but people understood that, and it works in many instances. This is that kind of indigenous knowledge, and so for me, I try not to create that separation between what one might call science or even modernity
Mm.
and that. I see a continuum.
This is interesting because I think sometimes we tend to be too discreet in these knowledge practices, but don't recognize the overwhelming connectedness there,
Yeah.
right? Um, Two questions from different people. One, Ryan Strange, and I'm going to combine the question. And Dr. Taslim Ras, who's in Cape Town, South Africa. The question is about how do you find allies in the work that you're doing, particularly when you're working against some of the power structures? And Taslim has a direct question there. Are there mechanisms available for Global South researchers to hold global funders accountable? Withholding labor is not an option, he says.
Allies and then accountability. Um, I in its heyday, when it was great, Twitter was a great place to find allies. It's not as great as it used to be. But it still does some of that.
Yeah.
Um, uh, I hold close to my friends. I tend to have a very stable friendship network. I've had that all my life. And I love the people who I love. And I think it's very important uh, to take friendship seriously in this kind of work, that your friends will sustain you.
Mm.
Um, um, and to make new friends too. And you would always, I think, find those opportunities and meet people who are thinking alike.
Yeah.
And to find them and to hold them, I think is important. Um, to the point about accountability, especially from the global south, um, I'm going to speak as a Nigerian, and I apologize if this is too specific. Um, um, the people I know, including friends of mine who are in Nigeria, who are often trying to push for something else, um, for 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 funders behaving differently. Um, get a lot of pushback from fellow Nigerians.
Mm.
Um, and when I used to work in the Ministry of Health in Nigeria, that was also my reality. In fact, my first faux pas in a big World Bank meeting was me having a proper debate with this World Bank guy who has come to do stuff, and explaining to him why it doesn't make sense. And I was pulled to the side after the meeting. I said, don't do that again. Um, so I just wanted to first foreground that it's even within a country, often it's a difficult thing to do. That these guys come with money, and it's hard to challenge someone who has come with money. It's difficult. Um, so just saying that first. Second, is I feel that funders are, if they've ever been open to being challenged, they're certainly open now
Mm.
to being challenged. And I think what would be wise to do is to find avenues to say what you need to say. It could be in person, it could be in writing, it could be in a meeting. I think it's important to put those ideas on the table when it is safe and wise to do so. To put those ideas on the table, because I think that there is the effect of numbers. If they hear similar things across 5 countries within the space of 3 weeks, they know there's something afoot. And I think those kinds of things are beginning to happen slowly. They're beginning to see that there's something going on. Now, it's often difficult, you see, as I was describing earlier. There are people who will very, very gladly take whatever.
Yeah.
Um, so if a funder wants to justify what they are currently doing, they just point to those people like, look, people are happy. Right? And I've seen funders do that. A lot, in fact. So, but again, to the extent that you can make a case and make a point, please make it. Now, the other way in which I think about this problem is that uh, when funders ask for a certain thing, very often they have asked for that thing because some academics have told them that's what they should ask for. In other words, these ideas didn't just drop into the heads of funders. It's come from somewhere. It's very likely come from people who are in a community.
Yeah.
So sometimes it is those people that we have to aim our pushbacks at and sort of say, but this is not the right thing to do, or explaining carefully. One more thing before I leave that question. I was describing earlier that I'm beginning to put myself in a place where I'm sort of wanting to really pick bodies of work and explain what is going on. For me, part of that is to serve two purposes. One is so that it can be used to teach.
Mhm.
Because I think that there's a paucity of material to teach about epistemic injustice
Right.
very clearly. That there's certain the status quo gets taught, and what one ought not to do and why does not get taught.
Yeah.
As it was to teach, but also to do that, especially to the work of people who are very powerful. So it's also clear to people that these are not gods, that they are human beings, and sometimes they have lapses in judgment, and sometimes they advise funders to ask for silly things, and funders do so. So yeah, I think again, it's that transparency and being able to hold one another to account in this community that we must do.
This is wonderful. I'm reminded of a friend of mine, Christian Achema, saying the maturity of an NGO is when they say no to money. Interesting. So thank you for that. This has been wonderful. We are close to wrapping up. So I am going to start by saying, Seye, this has been wonderful. We could sit here for hours talking about this. I really appreciate the time. One important note here, this is a particular thanks to Seye, to you, and to Dr. Paul Quie and Dr. Phil Peterson. They've been instrumental in shaping a lot of our thoughts. So thank you, Paul. Thank you, Phil. I also am going to ask you to go to that website. And if you are so inclined, please contribute. We create this fund to bring such talks to you. And hopefully this will add to the knowledge systems that we generate. And then we create more of justice-based practices. We are going to send you a survey. In fact, Anna is going to drop in a survey link in the chat box right now. We look at the survey really seriously, so we would encourage you to please send us information about this talk and what are the topics you'd like to hear. Again, on behalf of the Center for Global Health and Social Responsibility, my thanks to all my staff members who made this happen, and to Dr. Seye Abimbola for this really thought-provoking and wonderful talk. Thank you all.
Very much.